Chapter 1. Introduction: The Second World War and the Search for Justice. The Second World War left the world in ruins. Millions of deaths, destroyed cities, a moral vacuum, and the awareness that humanity had witnessed previously unimaginable atrocities. After 1945, the international community was faced with the question of how to deal with those responsible for these crimes. In Europe, it was the Nuremberg trials that for the first time attempted to hold statesmen, generals, and ideologues accountable for aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. In the Asia-Pacific region, this task took the form of the Tokyo trials. Japan had pursued aggressive expansionism in the decades before the war. Since the late 19th century, after the Meiji Restoration, the country has strived for recognition as a great power. In the first half of the 20th century, this led to a series of conquests. Korea was annexed, parts of China were occupied, and later Japanese attacks spread to large parts of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. With the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, Japan finally attacked the United States and made the Pacific the main theater of war. But the war in Asia was not just a succession of military conquests. It was accompanied by systematic war crimes. The Nanking massacres in 1937, in which tens of thousands of civilians were murdered, are one of the best-known examples. But forced labor, the cruel treatment of prisoners of war, the use of civilians in military projects, mass rape, and medical experiments by the notorious Unit 731 in Manchuria are also among the dark sides of Japanese warfare. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, triggered by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the entry of the Soviet Union into the war against Japan, the question of reckoning arose. The Allies had already determined at the Potsdam Conference that the Japanese leadership must be held accountable for its crimes. It was no longer acceptable for those responsible to go unpunished. The international community wanted to send a signal that aggression and cruelty would not be without consequences. The establishment of an international tribunal in Tokyo was a direct expression of this attitude. Here, not ordinary soldiers or local commanders, but the highest representatives of the Japanese state and military were to be brought to justice. The aim was to create a legal basis for the responsibility of state leaders and to reaffirm the principles that had already been applied at Nuremberg, that not only deeds, but also decisions and planning of wars of aggression could be punishable. The Tokyo trials, officially called the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE, began in May 1946 and dragged on for more than 2.5 years. They became one of the largest trials in history, with dozens of defendants, hundreds of witnesses, tens of thousands of documentary evidence, and an international panel of judges. From the very beginning, this tribunal was caught between justice and politics. On the one hand, it was an attempt to establish universal legal principles and to hold the perpetrators accountable for their crimes. On the other hand, it was inextricably linked to the reality of victors' justice. The Allies were judges and prosecutors at the same time, while their own war crimes, such as the atomic bombings or the Soviet massacres of Japanese prisoners of war, were not addressed. Despite these contradictions, the Tokyo trials had enormous historical significance. They made it clear that even the highest leaders are not above the law, and that aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity are universally outlawed. At the same time, they were a reminder that international law must not only be theory, but must be applied concretely, even if this application is imperfect. The Tokyo trials are thus more than a chapter of post-war justice. They are a reflection of the hopes and contradictions of the immediate post-war period. They show an attempt to learn lessons from the unprecedented horrors of war, and they reveal the difficulties of enforcing law and justice in a world shaped by power interests. Chapter 2. The Idea of International War Crimes Trials. The Tokyo trials were not an isolated event, but part of a larger development. the emergence of the idea that war crimes must not go unpunished and that there must be international mechanisms for this. Although this idea had its breakthrough in the 20th century, its roots go back a long way. As early as the 19th century, lawyers and philosophers had begun to think about rules for warfare. The Hague Peace Conferences of 1899 and 1907 laid the first foundations for modern international law. Rules were agreed there on the treatment of prisoners of war, the treatment of civilians, and the prohibition of certain weapons. But although these agreements created a legal framework, one central element was missing: enforcement. Those who broke the rules did not have to fear personal punishment. States could protest, but there were no international courts holding individuals liable. The First World War showed the weakness of this system. At that time, too, there were massacres, systematic mistreatment of prisoners of war, and attacks on civilians. After the end of the war, there were attempts to bring those responsible to justice, for example, through the Treaty of Versailles, which provided for the German Emperor Wilhelm II to be brought before an international court. But these plans failed. Wilhelm fled to the Netherlands, which did not extradite him, and many other proceedings came to nothing. The few trials that took place in Leipzig against German officers were perceived as a farce. The experience of the First World War made it clear that without consistent prosecution, international law was little more than a moral ideal. The idea that not only states, but also individuals should be held responsible for war crimes gradually began to prevail. During the Second World War, this idea was taken up again. As early as 1942, the Allies declared in the London Declaration that they would punish those responsible for war crimes. This was followed in 1943 by the Moscow Declaration, in which the Allies announced that German and Japanese war criminals should be brought to justice. For the first time, it was clearly formulated that there must be no impunity for those who systematically break international law. The Nuremberg trials, which began in 1945, were the practical implementation of this idea. They represented a turning point. For the first time, leading politicians, generals, and functionaries of a state were punished not only as victors in a war, but on the basis of universal legal principles. The charge of crimes against peace, i.e., the planning and execution of a war of aggression, was completely new. She made it clear that war was no longer accepted as a legitimate means of politics. The Tokyo trials were based on this idea. They were intended to show that the Nuremberg principles did not only apply to Europe, but were universal. Those responsible in Japan should not be released from responsibility with reference to cultural differences or regional peculiarities. Especially in a world striving for global order, it was crucial that the same standards were applied everywhere. At the same time, the Tokyo trials reflected the political realities of the post-war period. They were not so much an idealistic project of the international community as an instrument of the Allies to consolidate their authority in Japan. Above all, the USA, which had assumed the main responsibility for the occupation of Japan after the capitulation, saw the trials as an opportunity to enforce law and order and, at the same time, to distance Japanese society from the worst excesses of the war years. The idea of international war crimes trials was thus both a moral ideal and a political tool. It embodied the dream of a world in which law triumphs over force, but at the same time, it was shaped by the interests of the powers that enforce the law. The Tokyo trials were precisely in this area of tension, and thus made it clear how difficult it is to create justice in a world dominated by power politics. Chapter 3. From Nuremberg to Tokyo: Differences and Parallels. The Tokyo trials cannot be understood without comparing them to the Nuremberg trials. Both tribunals arose from the same historical situation: the need to come to terms with the crimes of the Second World War and to bring to justice the highest leaders of the defeated powers. Nevertheless, they differed in important respects, both in their organization and in their political importance. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, were the first major international tribunal against the leadership of a defeated state. Here, 24 main defendants, including Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Rudolf Hess, were charged with war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. The tribunal was the result of intensive negotiations between the four main victorious powers, the USA, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France, and was considered a precedent for international criminal justice. The Tokyo trials, which opened a few months later in May 1946, were intended to transfer this idea to the Asia-Pacific region. Here, too, the aim was to hold the highest representatives of a state, politicians, generals, and diplomats, responsible for the planning and conduct of a war of aggression as well as for numerous war crimes. In this respect, the content was similar, but the concrete design differed significantly in several points. Initially, the Tokyo trial was more dominated by a single power. While Nuremberg was the result of a collective project of the four victorious powers, the Tokyo trials were firmly in the hands of the United States. General Douglas MacArthur, commander-in-chief of the Allied occupation forces in Japan, appointed the chief prosecutor, determined the organizational framework, and retained final authority over the tribunal. Although judges and prosecutors from other Allied states were also involved, the USA set the tone. Another difference lay in the composition of the bench. Representatives of the four main victorious powers sat in Nuremberg, while 11 judges from different countries were appointed in Tokyo, including Australia, Canada, India, the Netherlands, and the Philippines. This broader international participation reflected the global nature of the Pacific War, but also led to tensions, as not all judges shared the same view of law and justice. The time frame was also different. While the Nuremberg trials lasted a little more than a year, the Tokyo trials dragged on for 2.5 years. With 419 days of trial and thousands of documents and witnesses, they became one of the longest trials in modern history. This was due not only to the scale of the crimes, but also to the complex international organization and the large number of defendants, a total of 28 men, 7 of whom were eventually sentenced to death. Another difference lay in the public's perception of the trials. The Nuremberg trials were more in the spotlight and were perceived worldwide as a symbol of the new era of international law. The Tokyo trials, on the other hand, took place in a politically more complicated situation. While Nuremberg was still anchored in the immediate post-war spirit of reckoning, the Tokyo trials were already overshadowed by the beginning of the Cold War. For the United States, it was more important to win Japan as an ally against the Soviet Union than to uncompromisingly deal with all aspects of the war crimes. Despite these differences, there were also many parallels. Both tribunals introduced the new charge of crimes against peace, i.e., planning and conducting a war of aggression. Both made it clear that state leaders could not hide behind the order from above argument, and both sent a signal that aggression and war crimes were no longer internal affairs of a state, but issues of international importance. In summary, Nuremberg and Tokyo were twins of the same idea, but not identical twins. While Nuremberg was more strongly remembered as a global symbol, Tokyo was more strongly influenced by political interests and often faded into the background in public perception. Nevertheless, it was of central importance for the development of international law that such a tribunal also took place in the Asia-Pacific region. Chapter 4. The establishment of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE. The establishment of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE for short, was a direct result of the Japanese surrender in August 1945. With the signing of the Instrument of Surrender aboard the USS Missouri, the Allied occupation of Japan under the command of General Douglas MacArthur began. In addition to the political, economic, and social reorganization of Japan, the legal reappraisal of war crimes was also one of the tasks of this occupation. MacArthur, who, as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, exercised virtually absolute authority in Japan, was the central figure in the establishment of the tribunal. He did not act on his own, but within the framework of the Allied agreements, in particular the Potsdam Declaration of 1945, which expressly provided for the punishment of the Japanese leadership. Nevertheless, his decisions had a decisive influence on the concrete shape of the court. On January 19, 1946, MacArthur issued the Charter of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which was similar in many respects to the Nuremberg Charter. It established the legal framework, defined the jurisdiction of the court, and determined the procedure. It was based on the conviction that Japan's supreme leaders were personally responsible for planning, conducting, and justifying wars of aggression and for countless war crimes. The charter provided for the indictment in 3 categories, which were oriented towards Nuremberg: crimes against peace, the planning, preparation, and conduct of wars of aggression; war crimes, violations of the laws and customs of war, such as mistreatment of prisoners or attacks on civilians; crimes against humanity, systematic persecution, extermination, and other inhumane acts against civilians. The court was composed of 11 judges sent by the Allied states: the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, China, the Netherlands, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and the Philippines. This composition was intended to underline the international character of the tribunal and ensure that not only Western but also Asian perspectives were represented. The chief prosecutor was appointed by MacArthur. It was the American Joseph B. Keenan, an experienced lawyer who had the task of preparing the indictment and presiding over the trial. He was assisted by prosecutors from the other states involved. The defense was taken over by Japanese lawyers, but they were faced with a difficult tension. They had to defend their clients before a tribunal whose legitimacy was questioned by many in Japan. The official opening of the tribunal took place on May 3, 1946 in Tokyo, in the building of the former War Ministry, which had been converted for the trial. Already in the first few days, it became clear that it would be a mammoth trial. 28 high-ranking defendants were on trial, including former prime ministers, generals, diplomats, and business bosses. The indictment comprised over 50 counts, and the preparation of the evidence took months. The establishment of the IMTFE was a historic step. For the first time in Asian history, an international court was created that would not only prosecute individual war crimes, but also hold the political and military leadership of an entire state accountable for aggression and systematic disregard for international law. But criticism was voiced right from the start. Some accused the tribunal of being an instrument of victor's justice, since only the crimes of Japan were dealt with, but not the war crimes of the Allies, such as the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki or the Soviet massacres of Japanese prisoners of war. Others saw the dominance of the USA as an imbalance that called into question the objectivity of the proceedings. Despite these controversies, the IMTFE sent a clear signal. The era of impunity for war crimes was over. Leaders could no longer hide behind the sovereignty of their state. The tribunal in Tokyo thus took up the precedent of Nuremberg and helped to lay the foundations for modern international criminal law. Chapter 5: The Legal Basis and the Mandate of the Tribunal. The Tokyo trials were not only a political project of the Allies, but also a legal experiment. There was no long tradition of international criminal courts to fall back on. The legal basis would therefore have to be created from scratch or adapted from existing concepts. The mandate of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE, was based on a mixture of international law, the experience of Nuremberg, and the specifications of the Allied occupying power. The most important source of law was the IMTFE Charter, which was issued on 19 January 1946 by General Douglas MacArthur. It defined the structure of the tribunal, jurisdiction, charges, and rules of procedure. Formally, the charter was a decree of the Supreme Allied Commander-in-Chief based on the decisions of the Potsdam Declaration of 1945. This made it clear that the legal basis was not a treaty between states with equal rights, but an order of the victors over the vanquished. The charter adopted the three central categories of Nuremberg. Crimes against peace. This was the most innovative and, at the same time, most controversial point. What was meant was the planning, preparation, initiation, and waging of wars of aggression or wars in violation of international agreements. In Tokyo, the focus was on Japanese expansionist policy since the 1930s, from the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 to the war in China and the attack on Pearl Harbor. War crimes. These included classic violations of the laws of war, such as mistreatment of prisoners of war, attacks on civilians, or the killing of hostages. Examples of this were the massacres in Nanking, the cruel treatment of Allied prisoners, or the forced labor of civilians. Crimes against humanity. This category, which had already been introduced at Nuremberg, included systematic killings, extermination, enslavement, and other inhumane acts against the civilian population. In Tokyo, this point was emphasized less often than in Nuremberg, but it played a role in the massacres and oppression of the population in occupied territories. The charter also stipulated that individual responsibility applied. Unlike in previous wars, the defendants could not hide behind the responsibility of the state or their superiors. The argument "order from above" was also restricted. Although it could be taken into account as a mitigating circumstance, it did not absolve the guilt. In doing so, the IMTFE took up one of the central tenets of Nuremberg, that people are not merely tools of the state, but are themselves liable for their actions. Another important point of the mandate was the composition of the bench. The 11 judges were to represent as broad an international spectrum as possible. But here, too, the political imprint was evident. The appointment was made by the Allies, not by an independent international institution. With MacArthur, the USA had decisive control, even if judges from countries such as India, the Netherlands, or the Philippines participated. The charter also regulated the procedure. Unlike in national criminal trials, the court was not bound by traditional rules of evidence. Documents, testimonies, or even newspaper articles could be admitted as evidence if the court deemed them relevant. This facilitated the work of the prosecution, but also led to criticism of the rule of law of the trial. The question of retroactivity was particularly controversial. Critics argued that the charges, in particular crimes against peace, were not clearly enshrined in international law at the time of the crimes. The prosecution countered by pointing out that international law had long outlawed aggression and breach of treaty, even if there had been no individual punishment so far. This revealed a fundamental conflict. Was it a matter of applying existing law or of creating new law to hold the perpetrators accountable? The mandate of the tribunal was therefore ambivalent from the beginning. On the one hand, it represented a milestone in the development of international criminal law. For the first time, Asian war crimes were prosecuted at the highest level. On the other hand, it was inseparable from the power relations of the post-war period and bore the features of a law imposed by the victors. It was precisely in this tension between idealistic aspirations and political reality that the historical significance of the IMTFE lay. It was an attempt to transfer the Nuremberg principles to the Pacific, and at the same time, proof of how difficult it was to enforce universal legal norms in a world full of power interests.
Chapter 6. The Charges. Crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity. The indictment of the Tokyo trials was a huge document. It included over 50 charges and was directed against 28 high-ranking representatives of Japanese politics, the military, and the administration. In its structure, it reflected the basic ideas of Nuremberg. Those responsible were to be held accountable not only for concrete atrocities, but also for the planning and implementation of a war of aggression. The first category concerned crimes against peace. This was the most innovative and at the same time most controversial charge. The defendants were accused of developing and implementing a comprehensive plan for Japan's expansion. This plan began with the occupation of Manchuria in 1931, continued with the war against China from 1937, and culminated in the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. The prosecution argued that these acts were not isolated, but part of a long-term strategy to bring Asia under Japanese domination. In doing so, Japan had violated the principle of peaceful conflict resolution and unleashed a war of aggression, a crime that was already prohibited at the time under the Hague Conventions and other international agreements. The second category included classic war crimes. This was about violations of the laws and customs of war, as they had been enshrined in international law for centuries. The systematic mistreatment of prisoners of war was particularly serious. Allied soldiers who were taken prisoner were often beaten, tortured, forced to do forced labor, or even executed. The notorious Bataan Death March in the Philippines, in which thousands of prisoners died, was also one of the central charges. Another major topic was the massacres of civilians. In particular, the Nanking Massacre in 1937, in which tens of thousands of civilians were murdered and women were raped en masse within a few weeks, was the focus. Systematic atrocities also occurred in other occupied territories, such as Korea, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. The prosecution cited evidence of looting, destruction, and murder that went far beyond what could be considered normal wartime violence. The category of war crimes also included the medical experiments of the notorious Unit 731 in Manchuria. Here, prisoners were abused for experiments with biological and chemical weapons, operated on without anesthesia, or infected with diseases. These practices were so cruel that many contemporary witnesses were only able to give their testimony under the most severe psychological stress. The third category was crimes against humanity. This term was introduced in Nuremberg to legally record the systematic crimes of the Nazis against Jews, Roma, and other population groups. It was also used in Tokyo, albeit with less weight. This included in particular the systematic persecution, forced resettlement, and cruel treatment of civilians in the occupied territories. The practice of the so-called comfort women, in which women from Korea, China, and other countries were forced into prostitution for the Japanese army, was also addressed in this context. The charges had a dual function. On the one hand, they were supposed to prove concrete crimes to the individual defendants. On the other hand, they were intended to paint an overall picture that Japan's leadership had deliberately and systematically unleashed a war and systematically disregarded the rules of international law. It was not just a matter of punishing individual acts, but of branding Japan's entire warfare as contrary to international law. Critics, however, complained that certain crimes were not charged. For example, the use of atomic bombs by the USA did not play a role, although massive civilian casualties were also to be mourned here. Soviet crimes against Japanese prisoners of war were also excluded. This led to the accusation that the tribunal acted selectively and was essentially an instrument of victor's justice. Despite these objections, the charges had historical significance. They helped to broaden the understanding of international law. In particular, the point of crimes against peace sent a new signal. Aggression was no longer just a political act, but a crime for which individuals could be held personally responsible. The indictment was therefore more than a legal document. It was a political manifesto intended to show that the international community had learned lessons from the Second World War. Even if it was not free of contradictions, it laid a foundation for the further development of international criminal law and shaped the perception of the Tokyo trials to this day. Chapter 7. The Selection of the Defendants, Military, Politicians, Bureaucrats. The Tokyo trials were not directed against ordinary soldiers or junior officers, but against the highest representatives of the Japanese state. The aim was to bring to justice those men whose decisions and plans had enabled the aggression and war crimes. The selection of the defendants was therefore of great symbolic importance. It was intended to emphasize the responsibility of the ruling class. A total of 28 people were on trial. Among them were 3 former prime ministers, numerous ministers, high-ranking military officials, diplomats, and leading bureaucrats. These men represented Japan's political, military, and economic elites who had led the country to war. At the top of the list was Hideki Tōjō, General and Prime Minister of Japan from 1941 to 1944. He was considered the face of Japanese warfare and was, for many, the epitome of aggression. Tōjō was both a military commander and a political decision-maker, and was therefore seen as the main person responsible. In addition to him, other politicians were indicted, including Koki Hirota, a former prime minister and foreign minister who was blamed for his role in escalating the war in China. Kuniaki Koiso, another prime minister during the war years, was also among the defendants. The military represented a large group. Among them were General Seishiro Itagaki and General Kenji Dohayara, who had been instrumental in the establishment of the puppet state of Manchukuo in Manchuria. General Heitaro Kimura and General Iwane Matsui have been held responsible for their role in war crimes in China, particularly the Nanking Massacre. Diplomats were also on trial. Shigenori Togo, former foreign minister, had to answer for his role in the negotiations and the escalation of relations with the United States. This selection was intended to show that not only generals and soldiers, but also politicians and diplomats were partly to blame for the aggression. A special feature was the indictment of high-ranking bureaucrats and business bosses. It symbolized that Japanese warfare was supported not only by military decisions, but also by economic structures. For example, Yosuke Matsuoka, former foreign minister and driving force behind the alliance with Germany and Italy, was indicted. A notable blank space, however, was the person of Emperor Hirohito. Although he was formally the head of the Japanese state and commander-in-chief of the armed forces, he was not brought to justice. At the insistence of the United States, it was decided to exempt him from indictment in order to ensure the stability of the occupation policy and to preserve the emperor as a symbol of Japan's reconstruction. This decision was highly controversial and is still being discussed today. Many saw this as the clearest proof of the political instrumentalization of the tribunal. The selection of the defendants thus reflected the ambivalence of the Tokyo trials. On the one hand, the main perpetrators of the war were to be brought to justice. On the other hand, certain people were spared or excluded altogether for political reasons. Nevertheless, the symbolism was strong. Not only generals, but also ministers, diplomats, and bureaucrats sat in the dock. This conveyed a central message. War is not only the work of the armies, but a product of politics, diplomacy, and administration. Everyone involved in the planning, organization, or justification bears responsibility. For the Japanese public, the selection of the defendants was a shock. Many of these men were well-known personalities who had been celebrated as heroes during the war. Now they were portrayed as war criminals. This break was part of the pedagogical effect of the trials. The people were supposed to recognize that they had been led into the abyss by a ruling class. At the same time, the selection also led to criticism. Some Japanese saw this as a humiliation. Others felt it was unfair that ordinary soldiers who had carried out orders were not taken into account, while the responsibility was shifted to a small group alone. In addition to him, so the compilation of the defendants was more than just a legal decision. It was a political signal to Japan, to the world, and to the future of international law.
Chapter 8. The Judge's Bench, International Composition and Tensions. A special feature of the Tokyo trials was the international composition of the bench. While only 4 judges from the main victorious powers, the USA, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France, were active in Nuremberg, Tokyo opted for a broader spectrum. A total of 11 judges were appointed to reflect the diversity of nations involved in the Pacific War. This composition was intended to give the tribunal more legitimacy and avoid the impression that it was an exclusively Western project. In addition to representatives of the Western powers, lawyers from Asian countries that had suffered under the Japanese occupation were also involved. Nevertheless, the heterogeneity of the bench not only led to a broader perspective, but also to considerable tensions and conflicts. The United States provided Judge William Webb from Australia as chairman. Webb was an experienced lawyer who had already conducted investigations into Japanese war crimes on behalf of the Australian government. It was considered factual, but also strongly influenced by the Allied perspective. From the Soviet Union came Judge Ivan Sarayev, who represented Moscow's hard line. For the Soviet Union, the trial was not only a legal, but also an ideological stage to emphasize Japan's guilt and at the same time emphasize its own role as the liberator of Asia. Sarayev made a special point of highlighting Japanese aggression against the Soviet Union and the communist movements in Asia. Great Britain sent Judge Sir William Patrick, while France was represented by Henri Bernard. Both attached great importance to legal rigor, but also tried to steer the proceedings in a direction that was compatible with the interests of their states. From the Asian side, judges from China, India, and the Philippines took part. Particularly noteworthy was the Indian judge Radha Binod Pal, who was later to attract worldwide attention with a dissenting opinion. Pal not only criticized the legal foundations of the tribunal, but also saw the Tokyo trials as an example of victors' justice. For him, no court set up exclusively by the victors could claim the moral authority to judge the accused impartially. His dissenting verdict, which recommended an acquittal of all defendants, remained a historic milestone and is still being discussed today. The Philippines, which had suffered particularly from the Japanese occupation during the war, was represented by Judge Delphine Jaranella. He had survived the infamous Bataan Death March himself and was therefore shaped by personal experiences. Critics saw this as a possible bias, but at the same time his presence gave the tribunal a special authenticity. Judges from Canada, New Zealand, and the Netherlands completed the international panel. They represented states that had been directly or indirectly affected by the Pacific War and whose citizens had been victims of Japanese war crimes. The diversity of the bench of judges brought a broad perspective, but it also led to tensions. Different legal traditions, Anglo-Saxon common law, continental European law, and Asian legal traditions collided. In addition, there were political differences. While some judges saw the trial as a necessary reckoning, others saw it as a farce dictated by the victors. The discussions about the interpretation of the crimes against peace were particularly controversial. Some judges considered this category to be a retroactive penal provision that was not sufficiently enshrined in international law. Others emphasized that aggression had long been outlawed under international law and that the punishment was therefore justified. The bench thus reflected the ambivalence of the entire tribunal, the claim to universal justice on the one hand, the reality of political interests on the other. The international body gave the trial symbolic weight, but could not completely refute the accusations of the victor's justice. In the end, it was precisely the diversity of the judges' voices that made the Tokyo trial so unique. While the majority verdicts established the guilt of the defendants, the dissenting opinions, above all that of Radha Binod Pal, offered a critical counterpoint. They made it clear that while the international community was moving towards universal legal principles, this path remained marked by tensions, contradictions, and open questions.
Chapter 9. The Role of the Prosecutors and the Defense Attorneys. The Tokyo trials were not only a tribunal of judges, but also a venue for prosecutors and defense attorneys, who took on opposing roles in the trial. Their work had a decisive influence on the course of the proceedings, as they determined what evidence was presented, what arguments were produced, and what narratives about guilt and responsibility were developed. The prosecution was led by an international team dominated by the United States. The chief prosecutor was the American Joseph B. Keenan, an experienced lawyer and close confidant of the U.S. government. He was appointed directly by General Douglas MacArthur and thus had clear political backing. Keenan saw his task not only as a legal mission, but also as a moral one. He wanted to show that Japan's leadership had unleashed a criminal war and that their actions could not go unpunished. Keenan was supported by prosecutors from the other allied nations, each of whom took on certain topics. Australian prosecutors, for example, focused on war crimes in Southeast Asia. Chinese representatives on crimes in China, while Dutch prosecutors shed light on Japanese crimes in Indonesia. This division not only reflected the international dimension of the trial, but also allowed for an enormous wealth of evidence. The task of the prosecution was complex. It not only had to prove individual crimes, but also establish the big picture, that Japan's leadership had been pursuing a long-term plan to conquer Asia since the 1930s. This idea of a joint conspiracy plot was central to the accusation of crimes against peace. To prove this, the prosecution presented a huge amount of documents: government protocols, diplomatic cables, military orders, as well as testimonies from survivors and experts. The defense was faced with a difficult task. It consisted mainly of Japanese lawyers who were in a delicate area of tension. On the one hand, they wanted to defend their clients in the best possible way. But on the other hand, they had to do so before a tribunal that was considered by many in Japan to be the winning court. The defenders tried to start on several levels. A central argument was the question of retroactivity. Many of the accused offenses, especially the crimes against peace, had not yet been anchored in international law at the time they were committed. The defendants could therefore not have known that they were committing a criminal offense. This violates the principle of nullum crimen, nulla pena sine lege. No crime, no punishment without law. Another defense argument was the appeal to the emperor. Many defendants emphasized that they had only acted in Hirohito's name and therefore could not be held solely responsible. However, since the Kaiser was deliberately kept out of the indictment by the Allies, this argument had no legal consequences, but caused additional controversy. The defense also claimed that the Allies had also committed war crimes, for example, by dropping the atomic bombs or bombing Japanese cities. The fact that these acts were not part of the indictment was seen by the defense attorneys as proof of the one-sidedness of the tribunal. Despite these arguments, the position of the defense was weak. The political dimension of the tribunal made it virtually impossible to question the basic premises of the trial. Many defense attorneys therefore concentrated on the strategy of relativizing the individual responsibility of their clients. They had followed orders, were only responsible for sub-areas, or had no knowledge of the worst crimes. Nevertheless, the defenders had an important function. They exposed the contradictions and weaknesses of the tribunal and upheld the principles of the law, even if the chances of acquittal were minimal. Their work made it clear that a tribunal could not have had legitimacy without a defense. Thus, prosecutors and defense attorneys in Tokyo faced each other not only legally but also symbolically. The prosecutors embodied the idea of a new international legal order that would punish aggression and war crimes. The defenders represented the doubts about this order, doubts as to whether it was really just, universal, and free of political instrumentalization. The tension between these two roles made the Tokyo trials an intense and often contradictory spectacle, in which not only guilt and punishment were decided, but also the foundations of international law itself.
Chapter 10. The Conduct of the Trial: Procedure, Organization, Interrogation Methods. The Tokyo trials were in many ways a mammoth organizational project. With 419 days of trials, more than 400 witnesses, tens of thousands of pages of documentary evidence, and over 2 years of duration, it was one of the largest court cases in modern history. Even the logistics posed enormous challenges for those responsible. A tribunal with 11 judges from different countries, an international team of prosecutors, a large number of defense lawyers, and 28 high-ranking defendants had to be brought together in a regulated procedure. The negotiations took place in the building of the former Japanese Ministry of War in Tokyo, which was converted for this purpose. The courtroom was designed in such a way that there was room for all participants. Judges on a raised bench, prosecutors and defense attorneys opposite, the defendants on a long bench in the center, flanked by guards. Translation services played a central role, as negotiations had to be conducted simultaneously in English and Japanese. An army of interpreters ensured that all participants could understand the statements, a task that caused enormous difficulties in view of the complexity of the legal language. The course of the trials was formally regulated, but it differed from classic criminal trials in some respects. The prosecution opened with a detailed presentation of its accusations, which were presented in long speeches and on the basis of documents. This was followed by the taking of evidence, testimonies from survivors, military officers, politicians, experts, and also from former Japanese officers. Many of these testimonies were shocking, reports of massacres, forced labor, mistreatment of prisoners of war. The evidence was particularly extensive in Tokyo. The prosecution presented more than 4,000 documents, including government protocols, diplomatic correspondence, and military orders. This written evidence was intended to show that Japan's aggression was not the work of individual fanatics, but the result of planned decisions by a political and military elite. A central aspect of the trial was the question of interrogation methods. Many defendants had undergone extensive interrogations during detention before they were brought to trial. Tensions arose. Critics accused the Allies that some statements had been made under pressure. Although the use of physical torture in the context of the Tokyo trials has not been officially confirmed, the accusation that interrogations were not always fair accompanied the trial from the beginning. The defense was given the opportunity to present its arguments and its own witnesses, but their work was limited by the structure of the tribunal. Since the judges themselves decided on the admissibility of evidence, many motions of the defense were rejected. For example, no witnesses to the atomic bombings could be heard, a clear signal that the Allies deliberately excluded certain topics. The conduct of the trial also revealed the cultural differences between the participants. While Western judges and prosecutors strongly insisted on legal formalisms, Japanese defendants were often shaped by ideas of honor, loyalty, and duty. Many appeared to be composed, but perceived the charges as humiliation. Some defendants, such as Hideki Tōjō, even claimed to take sole responsibility, an attitude that both commanded respect and underlined the political character of the trial. Another problem was the sheer length of the process. Over time, the public's attention waned, and the judges also reached their limits. Again and again, there were discussions as to whether certain evidence was relevant at all or whether the proceedings were overloaded. Nevertheless, those responsible persisted in documenting the complexity of Japanese warfare as comprehensively as possible. The conduct of the Tokyo trials was therefore a balancing act between legal rigor and political calculation, between international cooperation and national interests, between the demand for justice and the practical challenges of a gigantic trial. In retrospect, it is clear that the organization and implementation themselves were part of the message. The trial was not only intended to administer justice, but also to demonstrate that the international community was capable of setting up such a tribunal. In this respect, it was a milestone, despite all the imperfections and contradictions.
Chapter 11. The Evidence, Documents, Testimonies, and Films. The strength and credibility of the Tokyo trials depended largely on the evidence. The prosecutors had to prove not only individual crimes, but also paint a comprehensive picture of Japanese warfare, from the aggressive foreign policy to the systematic oppression of the population to the countless atrocities committed against civilians and prisoners of war. The dimension of the taking of evidence was therefore unprecedented. Never before had a tribunal been confronted with such a wealth of material. Documents were of central importance. After Japan's surrender, the Allies had confiscated huge quantities of government files, diplomatic cables, and military orders.
These documents prove that the aggression was not the work of individual officers, but the result of planned decisions at the highest level. For example, minutes from cabinet meetings were presented in which expansion into China and Southeast Asia was discussed. Telegrams and letters showed Japan forging alliances with Germany and Italy to achieve its goals. Particularly important were the documents that pointed to the involvement of individual defendants. For example, Hideki Tōjō could be directly linked to war crimes by written orders. Other generals and ministers were also confronted with evidence that proved their complicity or active support. In addition to the documents, witness statements played a central role. More than 400 witnesses appeared in the course of the trial, including survivors of massacres, former prisoners of war, Allied soldiers, but also Japanese officers who were willing to testify against their superiors. Many of these statements were harrowing and made the cruelty of the war tangible. A particularly striking example was the reports of the Nanking massacre. Survivors described how civilians were systematically murdered, women raped, and entire neighborhoods burned down. Allied witnesses who were on the scene at the time of the massacre also presented their observations. These statements gave the abstract charges a human dimension and made clear the suffering behind the legal terms. Also of great importance were the testimonies of former prisoners of war. They reported forced labor in mines, hunger, mistreatment, and death marches. Many of these testimonies were corroborated by medical reports documenting the physical and psychological traces of the abuse. In addition to written documents and witness statements, the prosecution also used visual evidence. Films, photographs, and recordings from the occupied territories were shown. These images had a strong impact, not only on the judges but also on the public. Film footage from Nanking, photos of forced laborers, or pictures of starving prisoners made the extent of the crimes undeniable. However, the evidence was not free of criticism. Some documents were taken out of context, some statements were contradictory or shaped by subjective impressions. The defense repeatedly complained that evidence was admitted that would not have been accepted in a normal criminal trial. Newspaper articles or reports that contained only indirect information were nevertheless admitted if the court considered them relevant. Despite these weaknesses, the taking of evidence was a milestone. She made it clear that the Japanese leadership was not clueless, but had deliberately taken a path of aggression and cruelty. The abundance of evidence left little doubt that the war crimes were systematic and not just due to individual excesses. The presentation of evidence thus also had a pedagogical function. It was addressed not only to the judges, but also to the world public and the Japanese people. The message was clear. These crimes have been documented, they cannot be denied, and those responsible must answer for them. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the taking of evidence from the Tokyo trials was not only important for the tribunal itself. Many of the documents and testimonies later became important sources for historiography. Without the meticulous collection and presentation of this evidence, a large part of the crimes might have been forgotten or denied. Chapter 12. The debate on war crimes against peace. One of the most controversial aspects of the Tokyo trials was the charge of crimes against peace. This accusation was not aimed at individual massacres or atrocities, but at the fundamental decision to wage a war of aggression. This did not focus on individual action in the field, but on the political planning and strategy of the Japanese leadership. The idea of punishing wars of aggression as crimes was new. There had already been approaches in international law, for example in the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, which emphasized the principle of peaceful conflict resolution. But until then, a war of aggression was considered more of a political injustice than a personal crime. States could be criticized for breaches of treaties, but individual decision-makers went unpunished. Nuremberg and Tokyo changed this fundamentally. For the first time, the planning of a war of aggression was considered a criminal offense for which individual politicians and military officers were held personally responsible. In Tokyo, the focus was primarily on Japan's expansionist policy since the 1930s. The prosecution argued that the occupation of Manchuria in 1931, the escalation in China in 1937, the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, and the conquest of large parts of Southeast Asia were not accidental or defensive acts, but part of a long-term plan to establish a greater East Asian sphere of prosperity under Japanese dominance. This strategy had deliberately violated international agreements and plunged the world into war. The defense questioned this accusation. She argued that there was no clear norm in international law that criminalized wars of aggression. Although aggression was outlawed, there was no legal basis for personal punishment. Many defense lawyers invoked the principle nullum crimen, nulla pena sine lege. No crime without a prior law. From their point of view, it was a retroactive prosecution that violated fundamental legal principles. In addition, the defenders referred to the double standards of the Allies. Other powers have also waged wars of aggression in the past without being punished for it, from European colonial policy to Soviet attacks in Eastern Europe. Particularly controversial was the reference to the atomic bombings of the USA and the carpet bombing of Japanese cities. If these acts were not considered crimes against peace or humanity, why should Japanese decisions alone be criminalized? These arguments led to intense debates within the bench. In particular, the Indian judge Radha Binod Pal sharply criticized the accusation of crimes against peace. For him, the indictment on this point was a classic example of victor's justice. The Allies had created a new legal principle and applied it exclusively to their opponents. In his dissenting opinion, Paul came to the conclusion that the charges were not legal in this form and that all defendants should be acquitted. The majority of the judges did not share this view. They argued that even if individual responsibility for wars of aggression was new in international law, the outlawing of aggression had existed for a long time. It is therefore legitimate to hold the Japanese leadership criminally responsible for its decisions. The debate about the crimes against peace made it clear how difficult it was to develop universal legal norms. On the one hand, it was a milestone that wars of aggression were no longer regarded as a legitimate means of politics. On the other hand, the question arose as to whether this standard was not first created in Nuremberg and Tokyo, and whether its retroactive application was really fair. In retrospect, it is clear that this dispute was not only of legal importance. It was also an expression of the political tensions in the post-war period. The Allies wanted to send a clear signal with the category, never again should a state be able to plunge the world into war with impunity. At the same time, however, the objections of the defense and individual judges revealed the limits of this claim, limits that continue to have an impact on debates on international law to this day. The category, crimes against peace, thus remains one of the most controversial but also most influential contributions to the Tokyo trials. It fundamentally changed the view of war and aggression and laid the foundation for the modern understanding of international law, even if its application was not free of political and legal contradictions at the time.
Chapter 13. The Responsibility of the Political and Military Leadership. A central concern of the Tokyo trials was the question of the responsibility of those men who had been at the top of politics, the military, and the administration. The war in the Pacific was not the work of individual unleashed officers, but the result of long-term decisions and strategies supported by a small but powerful leadership elite. The tribunal's task was to expose this elite not as an anonymous state power, but as acting individuals and to hold them criminally responsible. The focus was on the role of political leadership. Men such as Hideki Tōjō, Koki Hirota, and Kuniaki Koiso had determined the political direction as prime ministers, guided cabinet decisions, and thus exerted significant influence on Japan's aggressive course. They bore responsibility for the escalation of the conflict with China, for the attack on Pearl Harbor, and for the military expansion in Southeast Asia. The indictment made it clear that these decisions were not mere responses to external threats, but an expression of a deliberate strategy to establish Japanese hegemony in Asia. In addition to the prime ministers, foreign ministers and diplomats also moved into the spotlight. Men like Shigenori Togo and Yosuke Matsuoka had set Japan's foreign policy course in the 1930s and early 1940s. They were responsible for the conclusion of the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, which brought Japan into the camp of the Axis powers, and for the escalation of relations with the United States. The prosecution accused them of using diplomatic deception to conceal Japan's policy of aggression and thus paving the way for war. Another focus was military leadership. Generals such as Iwane Matsui, Seishiro Itagaki, and Kenji Dohaira were not only commanders in the field, but also architects of war strategy. They had given orders that led to massacres, forced labor, and systematic abuse. General Matsui played a central role in the Nanking Massacre. Although he later claimed to have known nothing about the worst excesses, documents and testimonies prove that he bore responsibility, at least indirectly. The trials also made it clear that bureaucrats and business leaders also bore responsibility. Men from ministries and state administrations had organized the war economy, procured resources, and used forced laborers. This made the war possible not only militarily, but also administratively and economically. The idea was clear. Crimes of this magnitude are only possible if entire institutions are involved and their leaders bear responsibility for them. The defense tried to relativize the responsibility. Many defendants invoke the emperor, whose will they had merely carried out. Others stressed that they had only checked parts of the area and had no knowledge of the worst atrocities. Some argued that they had only followed orders that they were not allowed to question. The tribunal accepted these arguments only to a limited extent. It was recognized that the decision-making processes in Japan were strongly characterized by loyalty and hierarchy. But the judges emphasized that high-ranking politicians and generals in particular had the power and the opportunity to influence or oppose decisions. Those who bore responsibility in the highest ranks could not invoke subordination. The question of Emperor Hirohito's responsibility was particularly explosive. He was formerly head of state and commander-in-chief of the army. Many defendants tried to shift the blame on him, or at least to present their decisions as imperial orders. But Hirohito was deliberately not charged, a political decision by the USA which wanted to preserve the emperor as a symbol of continuity and stability for the post-war order. This exclusion led to a vacuum. Officially, the ministers and generals bore responsibility, while the role of the emperor receded into the background. The Tokyo trials thus illustrated a fundamental principle of modern international law. Leadership positions mean responsibility. Anyone who plans, unleashes, or systematically enables war crimes cannot invoke structures, traditions, or orders. Responsibility increases with rank, and it does not end at the borders of the state. This principle was a decisive step in the development of international criminal law. It clarified that state and military leaders are not untouchable, but can be held accountable as individuals. This sent a signal that reached far beyond Japan, a signal that continues to have an impact in international court proceedings today.
Chapter 14. The Verdicts. Guilty verdicts, acquittals, and punishments. After more than 2.5 years of intensive negotiations, countless hearings of evidence, and passionate pleas by the prosecution and the defense, the tribunal came to a conclusion in November 1948. The verdicts were the culmination of the Tokyo trials, a moment in which efforts to establish justice manifested themselves in concrete guilty verdicts and sentences. Of the original 28 defendants, not all lived to see the end of the trial. 2 died while in custody, and another was not pursued due to health problems. The judges made their decisions against the remaining 25 defendants. The majority was found guilty. 7 defendants, including Prime Minister Hideki Tōjō,
Foreign Minister Koki Hirota, and General Seishiro Itagaki, Kenji Dohihara, Heitaro Kimura, Akira Muto, and Iwane Matsui were sentenced to death by hanging. These men were considered the central figures of Japanese aggression and the main perpetrators of the most serious war crimes. The executions were carried out in Tokyo in December 1948. 16 other defendants received life sentences. Among them were several prime ministers, ministers, and generals. For them, the tribunal found that their responsibility, while heavy, did not justify the maximum. 2 defendants received temporary prison sentences, but these were not fully served due to the long pretrial detention and political developments in the following years. It is noteworthy that there were no complete acquittals. Each of the defendants was found guilty of at least one count. This was a clear signal. The judges wanted to make it clear that no one from Japan's top management was innocent. The pronouncement of the verdict was a solemn but also tense moment. While some defendants accepted the decision calmly, others reacted with bitterness or contempt. Hideki Tōjō, who had tried to take sole responsibility several times during the trial, accepted his death sentence with composure and even spoke words of loyalty to the emperor before his execution. The verdicts triggered different reactions worldwide. In the Allied states, they were received predominantly positively. They were seen as proof that those responsible for the horrors of the Pacific War did not go unpunished. In many Asian countries that had suffered under the Japanese occupation, the execution of death sentences was considered an act of justice. In Japan, on the other hand, reactions were divided. Some saw the verdicts as a necessary reckoning with the old leadership. Others perceived it as humiliation and as an instrument of victor's justice. In particular, the exclusion of the emperor was perceived as contradictory. While ministers and generals were hanged, the head of state remained untouched. The verdicts also had a political dimension. Many of those sentenced to life imprisonment were released early in the 1950s, when Japan regained importance as an ally of the United States in the wake of the Cold War. Some of these men even returned to political office, a circumstance that raised the question of the sustainability of the sentences. Nevertheless, the verdicts had historical significance. They made it clear that the highest leaders of a state could be held personally responsible for wars of aggression and systematic war crimes. They sent a signal that went far beyond Japan. Aggression and mass crimes should no longer go unpunished. At the same time, the verdicts remained controversial. Critics complained that no allies were in the dock, and that central issues such as the atomic bombings or Soviet crimes were excluded. Others considered the death sentences too harsh or saw the long prison sentences as a political demonstration of power. In this way, the verdicts reflected the ambivalence of the entire tribunal. They were both a step forward in international law and a product of the political realities of the post-war period. They were an expression of the will to create justice and at the same time an example of the limits that this will found in a world full of power interests. Chapter 15: Executions and the Execution of Sentences. The pronouncement of the death sentences in November 1948 marked the end of a trial that had lasted several years, but it was not until they were carried out that the Tokyo trials reached their most dramatic and at the same time most symbolic phase. On December 23, 1948, shortly before Christmas, the sentences were carried out on 7 of the most prominent defendants. This day went down in history, as an act of justice for some, as a symbol of victor's justice for others. The executions took place in Sugamo Prison in Tokyo, which was used as a prison for war criminals during the occupation. The 7 men, including Prime Minister Hideki Tōjō, Foreign Minister Koki Hirota, and General Seishiro Itagaki, Kenji Dohara, Heitaro Kimura, Akira Muto, and Iwane Matsui, were executed during the night. The procedure began at midnight, and all sentences were carried out by the early hours of the morning. The executions were carried out by hanging, a method established by the American authorities. Military police of the U.S. Army monitored the proceedings. Each of the condemned was given the opportunity to say last words, and many used this moment to reaffirm loyalty to the emperor or to preserve their honor. Hideki Tōjō, for example, was composed until the end and said that he had died for the nation. For the Japanese public, December 23rd was an ambivalent day. Officially, the population was only briefly informed, but the news spread quickly. Some saw the executions as a necessary consequence of the acts, others saw them as humiliation and an attempt to finally subjugate Japan. In particular, the fact that the emperor had been spared while his closest collaborators were hanged was much discussed. The executions were closely followed internationally. In the U.S. and other allied countries, they were largely seen as a just ending point that held the guilty accountable for their crimes. In many parts of Asia that had suffered under the Japanese occupation, there was a sense of satisfaction. In China, for example, where memories of the Nanking Massacre were still fresh, executions were considered long overdue justice. But there was also criticism. Some observers saw the executions less as an act of justice than as a demonstration of power by the victors. In particular, jurists who had already critically assessed the category of crimes against peace asked whether the death sentences were really on a legally indisputable basis. In addition to the executions, the life sentences for the other defendants remained. They were housed in prisons such as Sugamo, where they were often imprisoned under relatively strict conditions. But with the political changes of the 1950s, their fate also changed. In the course of the Cold War, when Japan was needed as an important ally of the USA against the Soviet Union, amnesties and early releases were granted. Many of those sentenced to life imprisonment were released and were able to lead a relatively normal life again. Some even resigned from political or economic office. The execution of the death sentences was therefore a symbolically strong signal, but it did not mark the final end of responsibility. Rather, it became apparent in the following years that the legal reckoning was closely linked to political realities. While 7 men were executed, others were later given the opportunity to become part of Japanese society again, a development that made the ambivalence of the tribunal clear. The executions on December 23, 1948, are still a central point in the memory of the Tokyo trials. They stand for the attempt to establish justice after the horrors of war, but also for the contradictions between law and politics that characterize the entire process. Chapter 16. Criticism and Controversies, Victor's Justice or Necessary Justice. Hardly any aspect of the Tokyo trials has shaped the historical debate as much as the question of whether it was real justice or victor's justice. Even during the trial, and even more so after the verdicts, it was clear that the trials had to be evaluated not only legally, but also politically. A field of tension arose between the claim of universal legal principles and the interests of the victorious powers, which still triggers discussions today. A central point of criticism was the one-sidedness of the indictment. Only the Japanese leadership was brought to justice, while the war crimes of the Allies were excluded. The dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the carpet bombing of Japanese cities in which hundreds of thousands of civilians died, or Soviet crimes against prisoners of war, none of this was mentioned in the tribunal. For many observers, this was the clearest proof that the court served not only justice, but above all the interests of the victors. Another accusation concerned the legal basis. In particular, the charge of crimes against peace was criticized as a retroactive effect. At the time of the acts, there were no clear international norms that defined wars of aggression as a personal crime. The defense, and also individual judges, above all the Indian Radhabino Paul, argued that this violated a principle that is one of the foundations of every constitutional state. Nullum crimen, nulla pena sine lege. No crime, no punishment without law. Paul concluded in his dissenting opinion that all defendants should have been acquitted, as the tribunal stood on a legally questionable basis. There was also criticism of the political instrumentalization of the tribunal. The fact that Emperor Hirohito was deliberately not indicted, although he had played a central role in the war as head of state and commander-in-chief, underlined the political character of the trials. For the USA, the Kaiser was important to ensure the stability of the post-war order and to win Japan as an ally in the beginning of the Cold War. This made it clear that political considerations took precedence over a consistent legal reappraisal. The procedure was also criticized. The rules on admitting evidence were interpreted generously, allowing documents and testimony to be used that might have been inadmissible in a national criminal trial. This made the prosecution's work easier, but led to doubts about the rule of law. In addition, the defense lawyers were limited in many respects. Many of their applications were dismissed, and the chances of challenging the fundamental legitimacy of the tribunal were virtually non-existent. On the other hand, however, there were also weighty arguments that the Tokyo trials were necessary and just. Given the scale of Japanese war crimes, massacres like the one in Nanking, systematic mistreatment of prisoners of war, forced labor, medical experiments, it seemed intolerable to let those responsible go unpunished. Even if the legal basis was not perfect in all respects, the moral claim was clear. Aggression and crimes against humanity must not remain without consequences. Proponents also emphasized that the trials were a decisive step for the development of international law. Although they were imperfect in many respects, they laid down principles that were later developed in international treaties and courts. The idea that political and military leaders are personally liable for their decisions was a milestone. The debate about victor's justice or justice is therefore not an either-or, but reflects the ambivalence of the entire tribunal. The Tokyo trials were both an act of political power and an attempt to establish a new legal order. They were shaped by the interests of the Allies, but they also gave a voice to the victims and made the responsibility of the perpetrators visible. In retrospect, it becomes clear that without the Tokyo trials, international legal development would have been poorer, even if they themselves were not free of contradictions. They made it clear how difficult it is to enforce universal justice in a world of power politics, and that any attempt to do so will always be accompanied by criticism.
Chapter 17. The Impact on Japan: Politics, Society, and Culture of Remembrance. The Tokyo trials were not only an international tribunal, but also a profound event in the history of Japan. They had an impact far beyond the courtrooms and shaped the country's politics, society, and culture of remembrance in a multi-layered way. The sentences were not only intended to punish those responsible, but also to confront the Japanese people with the crimes of their leadership, a goal that was only partially achieved. Politically, the trials fit into the comprehensive occupation policy of the USA. Under General Douglas MacArthur, Japan underwent a profound transformation: demilitarization, democratization, and economic reconstruction. The processes were part of this project. They were supposed to delegitimize the old regime and pave the way for a new political order. By placing the blame on a small group of leaders, the majority of the population could be exonerated. Japan should not be collectively branded as a perpetrator people, but should be given a chance for a new beginning. However, this approach had ambivalent consequences. On the one hand, he helped not to completely destabilize Japanese society. On the other hand, it led many Japanese to feel that the war was exclusively the work of a few men. A deeper social examination of the responsibility for the aggression failed to materialize. In society, the sentences and executions were received differently. Some saw it as a just punishment for a leadership that had led the country into the abyss. Others saw it as a humiliation of Japan by the victors. In particular, the decision not to indict Emperor Hirohito caused tensions. For many Japanese, this was a signal that the trials were politically motivated, and that the Allies deliberately spared the emperor as a symbol of continuity. The culture of remembrance developed correspondingly ambivalently. In the early post-war years, the need for reconstruction was in the foreground. Many people were more concerned with hunger, poverty, and destruction than with the trials. It was only later that the question of how Japan should deal with its past became more apparent. While an intensive reappraisal took place in countries such as Germany, it remained fragmentary in Japan. Some currents in society interpreted the Tokyo trials as victor's justice and questioned the legitimacy of the verdicts. Conservative circles emphasized Japan's role as a victim, especially through the atomic bombings, and pushed their own responsibility into the background. This attitude has led to the fact that the trials are still controversial today. For some, they are a necessary step towards justice. For others, a symbol of foreign paternalism. At the same time, the processes also had lasting effects. They created an awareness of the limits of state power and helped Japan adopt a pacifist course in the post-war period. The new Constitution of 1947, which was created under the supervision of the USA, enshrined the renunciation of war as a means of politics. Even though this pacifism was later discussed and challenged again and again, it was closely linked to the experience of the lost war and the trials. In the field of remembrance culture, places and rituals emerged that are still controversial today. The Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, where some of those executed in the Tokyo trials are also honored, became a focal point of political disputes. While conservative politicians there want to show respect for the fallen, neighboring countries such as China and Korea perceive such visits as glorification of war criminals. Overall, the Tokyo trials led to a complex mixture of acceptance, defense, and repression in Japan. They laid the foundation for a political culture that officially focuses on peace and international cooperation, but at the same time lives with an ambivalent memory of its own past. The trials therefore had not only legal but also social consequences. They shaped Japan's self-image in the post-war period, influenced the country's political course, and left behind a debate about guilt, responsibility, and national identity that continues to this day.
Chapter 18. Comparison with the Nuremberg Trials. From the very beginning, the Tokyo trials were overshadowed by the Nuremberg trials. Both tribunals had the goal of holding the highest responsible persons of the aggressive powers accountable for their actions, and both are considered the cornerstones of modern international law. But despite many parallels, they differed in key points, in their organization, their perception, and their long-term effects. The most striking difference was in the political structure of the tribunals. Nuremberg was a joint project of the four main victorious powers: the USA, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. Each of these nations provided judges and prosecutors, and the decisions were shared by each other. Tokyo, on the other hand, was strongly dominated by the USA. General Douglas MacArthur set the framework, appointed the chief prosecutor, and had the final say on all important issues. Although judges and prosecutors from other countries were also involved, American dominance shaped the entire trial. A second difference concerned the composition of the bench. While Nuremberg was rather homogeneous with 4 judges, Tokyo had 11 judges from a variety of countries, including India, the Philippines, the Netherlands, and Australia. On the one hand, this gave the tribunal greater international legitimacy, but on the other hand, it led to considerable tensions. In particular, the Indian judge Radha Binod Pal, who wanted to acquit all defendants, caused controversy and made the differences in the assessment clear. The processes also differed in terms of timing. Nuremberg lasted just over a year, while the Tokyo trials took 2.5 years. With 419 trial days and tens of thousands of pieces of evidence, Tokyo was one of the longest court cases in history. As a result, public attention waned over time, and the process remained less firmly anchored in global consciousness. The charges were similar in both tribunals: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. But the weighting differed. In Nuremberg, the focus was particularly on the Holocaust, the systematic extermination of the Jews and other population groups. In Tokyo, on the other hand, the focus was more on aggression and classic war crimes, such as the massacres in China, the treatment of prisoners of war, and forced labor. Although crimes against humanity were also discussed, they played a smaller role than in Nuremberg. Another difference lay in the role of the head of state. In Germany, Hitler's responsibility as dictator, even if he was dead, was clearly emphasized. In Japan, on the other hand, Emperor Hirohito remained untouched.
He was deliberately not charged in order to ensure the stability of the post-war state. This decision had far-reaching consequences for the culture of remembrance and is still seen today as evidence of the political instrumentalization of the tribunal. In the public's perception, Nuremberg had a greater impact. The images of the verdict, the testimonies of Holocaust survivors, and the symbolic significance of the trials made Nuremberg the epitome of international justice. Tokyo, on the other hand, was less well received internationally and often viewed ambivalently in Japan itself, as a necessary reckoning, but also as a humiliation. Despite these differences, there are crucial similarities. Both processes establish the principle of individual responsibility. State leaders, generals, and ministers cannot disappear behind the facade of the state, but are liable for their decisions. Both trials also sent the signal that wars of aggression are no longer considered a legitimate means of politics. In the long term, both Nuremberg and Tokyo contributed to creating the basis for modern international criminal law. They paved the way for later international tribunals, for example for the former Yugoslavia or Rwanda, and finally for the International Criminal Court in The Hague. A comparison shows that Nuremberg was the greater symbol, Tokyo the less noticed but no less important counterpart. Together, they marked a turning point in the history of law, the attempt to draw a universal lesson from the unprecedented horror of World War II.
Chapter 19. The Tokyo Trials in the Light of International Law. The Tokyo Trials were not only a historic event, but also a milestone in the development of international law. They took up the Nuremberg principles, adapted them for the Asian-Pacific context, and posed the question of how universal these new legal norms actually were. This revealed both progress and limits, findings that continue to have an impact today. A key contribution was the consolidation of the principle of individual responsibility in international law. Until then, the rule was that states were bearers of international rights and obligations. Individuals, even if they committed serious crimes, were prosecuted at most by national law. With Tokyo, as before with Nuremberg, this framework was broken. For the first time, the highest heads of government, ministers, generals, and diplomats were convicted on the basis of universal norms. This made it clear that individuals are also subjects of international law if they plan aggression or commit mass crimes. Particularly important was the further development of the concept of crimes against peace. Even though it remained controversial whether this offense was already enshrined in international law before the Second World War, the Tokyo rulings set a precedent. From then on, wars of aggression were not only considered contrary to international law, but also criminal offenses for which those responsible were personally liable. This idea was later taken up in the UN Charter and the Statute of the International Criminal Court and is now firmly enshrined in international law. The category of war crimes was less new, but it was concretized and expanded by the trials. The mistreatment of prisoners of war, the massacres of civilians, and forced labor were no longer dismissed as side effects of the war, but were named as systematic crimes. In doing so, Tokyo made an important contribution to the enforcement of the Hague Convention on Land Warfare and later the Geneva Conventions. In the case of crimes against humanity, Tokyo's contribution was more ambivalent. While Nuremberg focused on this category, it played a smaller role in Tokyo. Although massacres and the practice of the comfort women were discussed, the systematic reappraisal of the Holocaust was missing. Nevertheless, Tokyo helped to anchor the term in international law, even if it only developed its full meaning later. At the same time, the Tokyo trials made the limits of international law visible. Many critics accuse them of practicing retroactivity and thus violating the principle of legal certainty. In particular, the Indian judge Radha Binod Pal emphasized in his dissenting opinion that the tribunal had created new law to punish acts retrospectively. The one-sided selection of the defendants, exclusively Japanese, no allies, also underlined that the law here was strongly influenced by politics.
These contradictions diminished the impact of the processes, but at the same time made it clear that international law never arises in a vacuum. It is always linked to power relations, interests, and historical circumstances. Tokyo showed how difficult it is to enforce universal norms when the international community is unbalanced. Despite all the criticism, the Tokyo trials were a decisive step on the way to the institutionalization of international criminal law. They proved that international tribunals are possible, that they can function, and that they can deliver legally viable verdicts, even if these verdicts remain controversial. Later institutions, such as the ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, or the International Criminal Court, consciously built on the experiences of Nuremberg and Tokyo. Many jurists see the two tribunals as the birth of modern international criminal law. Tokyo may be less well known, but its contribution is no less important. It brought the Asian perspective, focused on aggression, and showed the global dimension of the new law. In the light of international law, it can therefore be said that the Tokyo trials were neither perfect nor free of contradictions, but they set standards that are still valid today. They made it clear that war and crime are not internal affairs of a state, but affect all of humanity, and that it is possible to hold even the most powerful accountable.
Chapter 20. Conclusion, Legacy and Significance for the Present. The Tokyo trials were an event of historic significance. They represented an attempt to come to terms with the horrors of the Pacific War in legal terms, to clearly name responsibility, and to lay a foundation for a new international legal order. They were at the same time a reckoning with the Japanese leadership, a political instrument of the victors, and an experiment in the field of international law. Her legacy is therefore multi-layered and marked by ambivalences. Legally, the trials marked a breakthrough. They solidified the idea that political and military leaders are not unassailable, but can be held personally liable for their decisions. They helped to define wars of aggression as a criminal offense and to systematically document war crimes. Many of the principles that seem to be taken for granted in international law today were formulated and applied for the first time at that time. Without Tokyo, just as without Nuremberg, the development of modern international criminal law would hardly have been conceivable. Politically, however, the trials were inextricably linked to the interests of the Allies. The decision not to indict Emperor Hirohito, the exclusion of Allied war crimes, and the strong dominance of the USA made it clear that law and power were inseparable. This led to accusations of victor's justice that still reverberate today. At the same time, the trials showed that the enforcement of universal norms is only possible if they are compatible with the interests of the powerful. For Japan itself, the trials had ambivalent consequences. They delegitimized the old leadership and made a new political beginning possible. By placing the blame on a small elite, the population was given the chance to distance itself from responsibility and focus on reconstruction. At the same time, this concentration prevented a deeper social examination of its own role in the war. To this day, the memory of the trials in Japan is marked by tensions between recognition and resistance. Internationally, the Tokyo trials are less well known than Nuremberg, but their significance is no less. They brought an Asian perspective, addressed the violence in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, and made it clear that the suffering there was just as severe as in Europe. They broadened the horizon of international justice and made it more global. Her legacy continues to have an effect today. The Tokyo principles are reflected in the statutes of international courts, in UN resolutions, and in the work of the International Criminal Court. At the same time, the contradictions of the processes are a reminder that international law is never neutral, but always stands in the field of tension between justice and power. Thus, the verdict on the Tokyo trials remains ambivalent. They were a courageous step towards universal justice and a necessary attempt to name responsibility for unprecedented crimes. But they were also an expression of the power relations of their time, with all the limitations and inequalities that followed. It is precisely this ambivalence that makes it such an important historical event.
They show how difficult it is to reconcile law and politics and how necessary it is to try again and again. Her legacy is therefore not only a reminder of the past, but also a reminder for the present. Justice is never perfect, but without the attempt to enforce it, it remains an empty idea.